On today's episode, I want to do something a little bit different, and let me know what you think. A colleague of mine recently sent me a brand new article on a conspiracy that takes place during the time that we are looking at right now, the reign of Constantius II. And so because the article is timely for our narrative, and it's very interesting, it's about a conspiracy, and everybody loves a good conspiracy, I want to go ahead and take a quick detour and look at the article and its main arguments. The story is an interesting one about how Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian that we tend to think of as one of the more reliable sources for what's going on in the 4th century, well, Ammianus may have been lying about some things, deliberately. And a historian at Clemson University thinks she has found some evidence of this. So I want to go through the article, its main arguments, and give you a chance to hear what some researchers are doing right now in the field of Roman history. So let's go ahead and talk about this conspiracy on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 91. Ammianus Marcellinus, Forged Letters, and a Conspiracy under Constantius II. All right, like I said in my introduction, this is a little bit of a different episode, and I'd love to know if you want more of these or if you don't want me to do any more. I just happened to be at dinner last week with a few colleagues. I was asked about my podcast and what I was doing, and one of my colleagues recommended that I look into this article, and she sent it to me a few days ago. And when I looked at it, I thought, well, number one, this is pretty interesting. And number two, it just so happens that we are in this exact time period, so it wouldn't really be a disruption to go ahead and talk about the article now. The article is called Fraud and Forgery in the Court of Constantius II, the Silvanus Affair of 355 CE, and it appears in the journal Historia. And I encourage you to go ahead and check out that article if you can. Sometimes it's challenging to get academic journal articles. You have to have access to a university library or at least a university VPN. So I hope you can find it. And I also hope that you look up the work of Catherine Legenfield, who is an assistant professor at Clemson University. I don't know her and I've never met her, but I found this article pretty interesting. And maybe in the future, I'll talk about some more articles that I find interesting. Some of them more recent, maybe some of them less so. But let me know what you think of this sort of thing. Okay, I want to start with a striking quotation from Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian who wrote A History of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. He says that the Roman Emperor Constantius II welcomed the death of one of his generals named Silvanus, quote, with inconceivable joy, and gave way to exceeding insolence and arrogance, attributing this event to the prosperous course of his good fortune, giving the reins to his habitual disposition, which always led him to hate men of brave conduct, as Domitian in former times had done, and desiring at all times to destroy them by every act of opposition. That's Ammianus Marcellinus's Res Gestae, Book 15. So I just want you to pause for a moment and think about this. Was Constantius a paranoid tyrant who allowed a fraudulent conspiracy to destroy one of his loyal, brave servants? Or has the historical record been manipulated to paint him that way? And that's really the question that Catherine Legenfeld's article asks, and which I want to unpack today. So we're going to examine Ammianus's narrative, the mechanics of the conspiracy that he describes, Constantius's response. I want to look at the aftermath and the broader implications for how we might think about him as an emperor. Really, the big question here is how reliable is a historian when he has a personal stake in the story that he is writing about? So let's go ahead and frame the affair. I want to start with the key players, some of whom you have already met. There is Constantius II. He was the son of Constantine the Great. He ruled from his father's death in 337 to 361. He inherited the Eastern Empire at first, but then after his brothers were killed, he managed to control their shares as well, ruling the entire Roman Empire by the 350s. And his reign was not a placid one. He faced external threats. He had to deal with the Sassanid king Shapur II of Persia. He had to deal with all sorts of internal problems, usurpations, Christians fighting each other about orthodoxy and heresy. At one point, as we saw last time, he even appointed his cousin Gallus to be a kind of junior emperor, but within just a few years, Constantius ended up having him executed. In other words, the context in the 350s is an empire that is fragile and divided, with both external and internal threats in both the East and the West. Most of that stuff you already know, but you haven't met Claudius Silvanus. Silvanus was a Frankish-born Roman general whose father had served Constantine. By 355, Silvanus had been elevated to Magister Peditum in Gaul. This is a kind of commander of the foot, commander of the infantry. And he was very good in this position. He had repelled raids by some of the tribes that were coming across the Rhine, tribes like the Alemanni. He was loyal, but he became the victim of forged letters, supposedly from him plotting against his emperor, Constantius. Supposedly what happened is Silvanus, upon learning of the forged letters, realized he didn't have much choice other than to proclaim himself emperor, which he did on August 11th in 355, but his usurpation was short-lived, lasting only 28 days, and he was assassinated on September 7th. Now, our main source for this otherwise footnote in history is one Ammianus Marcellinus, and we've already heard from him. He is a Greek-speaking soldier that became a historian. He wrote his Res Gestae, which is a history of Rome in the 4th century, largely covering the years 353 to 378. He was an eyewitness to many of the events that he described because he was working under the Roman general Ursicinus. And in Ammianus's view, his emperor Constantius was a suspicious, paranoid tyrant, and the guy that took over after him, who we will meet soon, a guy named Julian, who was a pagan philosopher emperor, well, he was just a great guy. So let's get into the details now of the conspiracy, now that we've met everybody involved. Ammianus talks about what happened, according to him, in Book 15. What happened is Silvanus wrote innocent letters of recommendation, normal letters that you would send to advance your friends in the emperor's court in Milan. But some conspirators who were jealous of Silvanus took the letters and erased their contents with a sponge, lifting most of the ink off the page, but preserving Silvanus's signature. Then, with the now blank letters, they rewrote letters that suggested Silvanus was plotting a usurpation. The letters named accomplices like palace officials and senators. And then they took these forged letters to Constantius himself. And Constantius ordered the arrest of all of those involved. Now, the supporters of Silvanus heard about this, and they tried to tell the emperor, hey, we know this guy. He would never do something like this. This is totally fake. But Constantius didn't listen to them, and he instead sent one of his agents to Silvanus in Gaul to harass him and his associates, and this pushed Silvanus over the edge, essentially presenting him with no other option but to rebel if he wanted to save his own life. Then the conspirators produced a second forged letter, but this one was so bad that it was very clear that it had been faked. But Constantius decided to not prosecute the conspirators. In fact, he had some of them promoted, suggesting that he was a corrupt and awful emperor, which is exactly what Ammianus wants to show. And then, in the end, Constantius decided to have Silvanus assassinated, which he did by sending Ursicinus along with Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian himself, on a secret mission to assassinate Silvanus, which they did while he was in a worship service in church. In describing all of this, Ammianus says that he was basically a reluctant participant, just following the orders of his crazy, cruel, and paranoid emperor. Legenfeld argues that it was, in fact, reasonable that Constantius would have treated the letter seriously. It was not hard to forge letters. It makes sense that he would take the matter to a council of advisors, which he did, and it makes sense that he would be concerned about usurpation in the region of Gaul. This was a part of the Roman Empire that had had all sorts of troubles, both external and internal. If there was actually a rebellion in the area, the entire region would have been destabilized. The letter also suggested that there were supporters of Silvanus in Constantius's own court, so he really needed to act urgently. In other words, going after the conspirators based on reasonably solid evidence, even if it did end up being a forgery, was the action of a prudent ruler who was not simply paranoid, but actually cared about preserving the stability of his empire, which is kind of his job. Langenfeld also mentions the fact that Constantius, despite legitimately fearing a plot against him, nevertheless was pretty measured in his response. So one of Silvanus's supporters protested the arrest, saying that Silvanus had taken a military oath and had the right to a fair trial under Roman law. He was willing to go to Gaul to bring Silvanus to Milan. Constantius listened to this advice, and instead of issuing an arrest warrant, he just summoned Silvanus to Milan. Although he didn't send this summons via one of Silvanus's supporters, he sent a more neutral party. Now, Ammianus says that the neutral messenger failed to deliver the summons and began acting in a way which provoked Silvanus into rebellion. And maybe that happened, but there are other plausible explanations as well, that maybe Silvanus didn't let the messenger actually come into his camp. And so that's why the messenger didn't deliver the summons. Why does that matter? Well, Ammianus might have exaggerated this messenger's corrupt behavior to suggest that Constantius, the emperor, was actually trying to provoke Silvanus. But really, if we read between the lines, Constantius is being cautious here. He sent a neutral messenger and seemed to be looking to avoid open conflict or a civil war. There doesn't appear to be other evidence that shows Silvanus had mobilized a bunch of soldiers, so he seems to have been just as surprised that he was usurping Constantius as everybody else was. In other words, Constantius may very well have been interested in investigating, rather than being a kind of bloodthirsty, megalomaniacal tyrant hell-bent on suppressing this otherwise loyal general. And Constantius seems to have been willing to have some kind of trial. He didn't order an arrest, he ordered a summons. And the fact that he was fairly gracious to the conspirators who were involved in the forgery, again, shows that Constantius was being prudent, accepting realities, that he couldn't just execute people. His reign was tenuous. Constantius handled the second forged letter with equal reasonableness. This letter suggested that there was going to be some sort of rebellion, possibly near Milan, with one of Silvanus's supporters. But this letter was mishandled and actually sent to the supporter of Silvanus, who then showed that the letter was in fact fraudulent, and then Constantius ordered an investigation of the letters. An analysis showed that it had indeed been tampered with. One of the conspirators was then tortured, and he confessed. Several influential senators asked for clemency for the conspirator, and at the same time, Silvanus was pressed into rebellion, which suggested that even if there were conspirators involved in forging letters, it was true that Silvanus ultimately declared himself emperor. So Constantius had to figure out what to do, and in the end, he just decided to pardon the conspirators as a matter of political expediency. He didn't want to ruffle the feathers of a group of influential senators. There was now an active rebellion with Silvanus, so it just made sense to pardon them. It wasn't part of some kind of weird corruption. It's just politics. And Constantius was pretty merciful with Silvanus's supporters, which suggests that he extended clemency to both sides. If he really wanted to go after Silvanus, he would have killed a bunch of his supporters, which he didn't do. So Ammianus tries to say that Constantius was corrupt and stupid and cruel, that he was involved in some kind of cronyism, but in reality, Constantius was pretty strategic. and pragmatic. This was a period in Roman history where there were a lot of threats to the empire, there were various conspiracies, there was factionalism, and Constantius appears to have handled at least this episode reasonably well. And what it reveals is really that Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian, had an agenda. He wanted to portray Constantius as awful, and so he turned a situation where Constantius was being fairly moderate and reasonable into some manufactured evidence of paranoia and cruelty and corruption. Langenfeld notes that the fact that Constantius was willing to summon Silvanus rather than arrest him is really the decisive move that both shows Constantius as reasonable and also managed to get the conspirators to desperately expose themselves by rushing together another forged letter. And funnily enough, if we compare what Ammianus says to his hero, Julian, who praised his predecessor in his own letters, we have to wonder how truthful Ammianus really is. So what are the big takeaways here? Historians are not objective interpreters of the facts. They have agendas. Ammianus clearly has some grudges, which caused him to massage the facts in ways that fit his own animosities. And that's why we have to be very careful of taking even the primary sources at face value. A good thing to remember as we prepare for the next episode of the podcast, in which we discuss this hero of Ammianus Marcellinus, the Emperor Julian, and his brief but influential reign, in which the decades of Christianization were paused in favor of a return to paganism. We'll talk about that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.